All right, so this is going to be the A&P midterm review. Let me write my phone number here. You'll notice that sometimes I refer to things that they might have already happened, or I'm talking about things like not in the present tense. I made these videos earlier on in the semester, and so I didn't want to just go through and make all new stuff and talk about the same stuff for 2 hours or however long it is. So all I'm doing is just combining the last week 4 and week 5 recordings, which are current, with the week 1, 2, and 3 past recordings. So it's all the same content, but just know that if I start talking about random stuff and it doesn't sound familiar, that it's probably something that already happened. All right, so here's my contact information. Please reach out if you need anything. And all right, I'm going to skip forward and start on week 1.
Objectives like this, what I would try to do is pause the screen and I'll give you guys a second. Write down as much as you can remember, and then you can fill in the rest by what I tell you. But try to quiz yourself. Um, all of these are going to be separated by each week. So we're going to start with week 1. So define the terms anatomy and physiology. All right. So anatomy is um, the study of body structure specifically. So this would be like if you're looking at the shape of bones, maybe shape of organs, things like that. Whereas physiology is the study of body function specifically. And so maybe how the liver detoxes, that would be an example. Um, how the intestines move, boluses through, things like that. So if you just remember those two words, structure and function, that should get you the right answer if you have any questions on your exam about that. All right, so the next one, list the level of organizations of the human body. All right, so we're starting off with atoms. So that's going to be the very smallest unit. Then next up, whenever we have a few atoms that come together, that forms molecules. You put enough of those molecules together, you'll start to get cells. And then if enough of these cells come together, you'll get tissues. And then after this, enough tissues will start to form an organ. And then enough of those organs come together to create organ systems. And then all our organ systems come together to form an organism. And this is going to be the human body. Um, and if they ever ask a question on what is the smallest living unit in the human body, referring to cells. Okay. Describe the 12 most common organ systems. So we have integumentary. So this is your skin. So think protection from the outside environment. And then another big one that we talked about is temperature regulation. So sweating to cool us down is an example of that. Next we have skeletal system. So obviously has to do with the bones. And the biggest thing bones do obviously is support some level of protection, like our ribs protecting our vital organs. And then another big one that's important is blood cell production. That happens inside of bones. And we'll talk more about that whenever we get into skeletal, I think, this week. So the next one we have is muscular. So we're thinking obviously muscles here. So you can think of movement. Then adding on, how do muscles help to heat us up when we're too cold? I'll give you a second. So they allow for heat production. And what they do is they very quickly they contract and relax, they contract and relax. And when they do that, it generates heat. And that helps to bring our body temperature down. But if that stops happening, it so like if you lose this ability to shiver, that could be indicative of a problem in the brain. So your brain could be failing to provide the thermoregulation that it normally would. Okay, next one is nervous. So our nervous system, you're going to be thinking brain, but pretty much anywhere CNS and the PNS. So control, because our brain controls everything. Coordination, and then also communication. Not just like at the cellular level between neurons, but also just like communication in general. All right, next one is endocrine. And this, when you think endocrine, think of hormones, crazy amounts of hormones. And so the whole purpose of that is hormone regulation. Okay. Next up is circulatory or cardiovascular. Either way, that has to do with the heart. And the main thing for here is the transport of oxygen, nutrients, and then just blood in general. Okay, then we have our lymphatic, and so we're thinking the lymph system. So maybe lymph nodes, vessels, and its main role is fluid balance and also immunity. All right. And we have respiratory. So for here, we're thinking lungs and gas exchange is the biggest thing that happens in the respiratory system. So bringing in O2, breathing out CO2. We have digestive. So here we're thinking just pretty much our entire GI system. And so big function here is nutrient breakdown and absorption. have also urinary. So we're dealing here with the kidneys. So their main role is waste removal. And then another big one is fluid and electrolyte balance. So we'll go over that more whenever we get to renal or urinary. And then whenever you move on to pathophys, if you have to take that, you'll start to learn what happens if the kidneys start to shut down and you start to see the electrolyte balance kind of go wonky because typically, especially in like ICU settings, whenever kidneys start to fail, that's a very, very bad sign because your kidneys do so much. And then last but not least, reproductive. So you're thinking testes, ovaries, genitals, so male's penis, female's vagina, and the purpose here, obviously reproduction, but also lots of hormone production. So that should be pretty comprehensive, at least for this exam, for what you'll need to know. So, and hopefully you guys are, as you're watching this, you're stopping beforehand and writing all of it down. That's probably the best way to use this video. I'm sorry, I keep coughing. All right. The next one is to define homeostasis. So it's going to be the body's ability to maintain a stable internal environment despite external changes. So just to bring up an example from earlier that we talked about is thermoregulation. So for example, say somebody's body temperature drops down to 95.6 degrees, right? That is very, very hypothermic. And so their body's going to be like, oh crap, I need to warm myself up. And so your muscles will start to shiver, which generates heat. And so then the temperature might go up, maybe not a whole bunch, but to 97. This is way more sustainable with our internal environment than this 95.6 degrees is. And so some other examples of some other examples of things that need to stay in homeostasis. So we got temperature. Another example is blood glucose. So there's a really strong balance between glycolysis, which is breaking down that sugar that's in our blood, or gluconeogenesis, and that's what adds glucose to our blood. And we'll get more into that whenever we get into the endocrine system. But just know that it's very, very tight. Another one is blood pressure, right? So what's the two ways that we control that? We have vasoconstriction, and then we have vasodilation. And so vasodilation will drop your blood pressure. Vasoconstriction will increase your blood pressure. And vasodilation, so really decreased blood pressure, that is the problem in something called, and you guys probably know this, but anaphylaxis. So if you're going into, sorry, I'm not a good speller, so that's probably wrong. But anaphylaxis, you have a sharp release in a chemical called histamine, and histamine causes very sharp vasodilation, which in turn will drop your blood pressure. And so you might have heard of an antihistamine, okay, and so it drops that, so it kind of helps to decrease that vasodilation. But in anaphylaxis, the biggest thing you're going to want to use is something called an EpiPen or epinephrine. And the reason we use epinephrine is because that causes very sharp vasoconstriction, which will restore your blood pressure back whenever you're in anaphylactic shock. So I know that was a lot. You probably are really only responsible for this part. But if you can understand this part, you will be in very, very good shape for your exam. And please, please reach out if you have any questions. Or if you need to meet one-on-one before your exam. All right, so describe the anatomical position. I didn't want to, sorry. One thing I wanted to put here is that a lot of the time homeostasis relies on something called negative feedback loops. Okay, so say for example, we have A plus B creates C. Okay, so a negative feedback loop would be whenever we get enough C produced, C will actually cause an inhibition of B. And so by inhibiting B, we're stopping any more C from being made, because if we already have enough C, we don't want to just keep making it and have an overproduction. So we have to have a way to kind of push the brakes. And so a negative feedback loop is essentially pushing the brakes on a reaction, because if it blocks B from being formed, then you won't be able to create C. So just remember that term, negative feedback loops. All right. So describe the anatomical position. I put this picture here because I'm going to describe it, but I really feel like the best way to answer this question would be able to see it. So some of the biggest things that we have, so obviously standing upright, can't be slouching over, facing forward, biggest thing though, so arms at the side, palms, palms facing forward. And then your feet are just going to be just slightly apart. And then your toes are also going to be pointing forward. So I'm not really 100% sure how you would get a question about this, but I would not be surprised if you did. So if you come on your exam and they ask you a question and you're not sure, just try to remember the picture of this very, 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 very creepy looking guy right here. All right. So list the common terms that are used for the relative positions of the body. Okay, so actually, never mind. I was going to try to see if I could steal a picture of that guy, but that's okay. So I'm just going to draw my own little person here. So this is, in theory, stick figure anatomical position. So first term, I'm going to draw arrows and then give you a second and see if you can name it. So this is superior. This is inferior. This one's going to be kind of hard to draw, But imagine that if we were going, I'm going to draw this. So going into the page, and then this is going out of the page. So if we're going this way, so like from his sternum to his vertebrae, we're thinking posterior, right? So from front to back. Whereas we have this way, so say from vertebrae to sternum, this is anterior. And I know that's kind of hard to think about just because it's hard to draw the 3D structure. So if you need any help, just let me know. But if I drew him from the side, so it would be kind of like this, I guess. This is anterior, and then his back area, this is posterior. Okay. Then we have, if we're going closer to our midline right here, what's this called? So this is referred to as medial. And if we're going this way, away from the midline, that's referred to as lateral. Okay, get a different color here. So next up, a place that's closer to the point of attachment. So say for instance, I said, let me just think real quick. So in this instance, the elbow is proximal. So if I asked you, what is the elbow in comparison to the hand when we're talking about the shoulder? That's the point of attachment. The elbow is proximal because it's closer to that initial point of attachment. Now, if I was referring to the hand, so the hand is distal, or you can think another way would be distant from the point of attachment, which is right there. Let's see. This one's a little bit harder. How could I draw this? So let's just say that we have somebody like this. Sorry, I'm not a good artist at all, but say they're laying on a table like this. So superficial just means toward the surface. Whereas, so say that I was talking about somebody's skin, you'd be talking about more superficial. But then say I start to talk about their heart, compared to the skin, this is deep. All right. So if you guys have any questions there, just let me know. Yeah. Okay. All right. Describe the three major planes of the body. Okay. The first one we're going to talk about is the sagittal plane. And so this divides the body into right and left. So let me draw a little guy right here. So sagittal is this way. So it'll divide the body into a right and a left. And just remember that when you're looking at somebody in anatomical position, it's going to be flipped. Right and left is going to be flipped compared to your right and left. So that is very, very unfortunately common problem. I don't know if you guys like have been caught up with any medical news, but there was a surgeon who accidentally removed somebody's spleen instead of their liver, or it might have been the opposite, removed their liver instead of their spleen. Either way, they completely lost track of this because the liver would have been on the surgeon's right side, but it's on the patient's. So sorry, like the liver is on the right side for both. What I'm saying is when the surgeon's looking down, it would have been on his left, but the patient's right. All right, so number two, we're going to have the frontal plane. And so this is going to divide the body into anterior and posterior, so front and back. This is another one that I can't really draw that much. I can maybe do this. So just kind of imagine that it's kind of cutting him right down the middle and dividing him into anterior and posterior. And then the last one we have is the transverse plane. And this is going to be dividing the body into superior and inferior. Just imagine we pull one of those Houdini magic tricks and we cut him right down the middle. It's going to be splitting him into superior and inferior sections. Okay. All right, so list the anatomical terms for quadrants and regions in the body. So doing here, we say we have our little guy, and then we zoom into this section right here. So we'll draw his neck, draw his hands, but we are mostly concerned. Sorry, that's supposed to be hand. He looks like a penguin. So 4 quadrants. So this one is the right upper quadrant. This is the left upper quadrant. This is the right lower quadrant. And this is the, oops. And this is the left lower quadrant. And then if we are splitting it up, actually, wait. Okay, yeah. So they do want you to know regions. So let me make this a little bit smaller. I accidentally drew this a little bit too big. So now if we have the same thing right here, except this time, splitting up, we're splitting up into the 9 abdominal regions. Hold on just a second. Sorry, my pen was not working real well. So we're splitting it up here. We'll go 1, 2, and then 1, 2, like this. So this right here is the right hypochondriac region. And so that would mean this would be the left hypochondriac region right here. And then if we just keep moving down, so this is the right lumbar region. And so this would be the left lumbar region. And look this up on Google so that you get a better view because my drawing is terrible, but the regions are still right. And then down here we have the right iliac region. Over here we have the left iliac region. So if you can just remember, like, say that you just remember these 3, that's probably the best way to do it because then you can just say, okay, it's the same thing on this side. So just remember one side, and then the other side is just the same, just flip the directions around. And so this area is called the epigastric region. This is the umbilical region. And then this is the hypogastric region. So you can kind of remember that epi usually means above or around. So epigastric is above the gastric, above the stomach. Hypogastric, below the stomach. And then umbilical region, typically where your umbilical cord was connected, and it's where you have your belly button. So I would know both. I would know these are the quadrants. And then these are the regions. There you go. Okay. And then now describe the major cavities of the body. Oh, and real quick, I kind of just want to talk about what's in each of these regions because I don't know, maybe you'll get a question on it. So if we take this right here, so in the right upper quadrant, I'll give you a second. What's some stuff that you find in the right upper quadrant? So big one is the liver. And then remember the gallbladder is tucked right underneath the liver. Your right kidney. Remember your kidneys sit kind of high up. And then a part of your intestines called the duodenum, but I'm not sure how important that is, but I'm just going to put it down anyway. Duodenum. All right. Now, if we're thinking about the right lower quadrant, we're going to be thinking of things like the appendix. If you guys remember, we talked about McBurney's point, and so that's where somebody that's having an appendicitis, so infection and inflammation of the appendix, if you like push down on that area on the right lower quadrant, they will borderline jump off the table because of how painful it is. Another thing that we have is the ascending colon. So I'll erase it in a second, but basically our colon kind of looks like this. So we have an ascending part, we have a transverse part, we have a descending colon, and then we have a sigmoid colon right here. Next up, we got the left upper quadrant. So for our left upper quadrant, we're going to be thinking things like, well, here, I'll give you a second. So we're thinking things like the stomach, the spleen, left kidney, and also for both of these, for the kidneys, also remember that if they were to ask you where the adrenal glands are, that's the same place as the kidneys because the adrenal glands. So say we have our kidney right here. The adrenal glands is just the little party hat right here. It sits right on top. And then last but not least, the left lower quadrant. So we're thinking things like the descending or sigmoid colon. And that's what I had just drawn. That's what I just drew up there a minute ago. All right, so that should be pretty all-inclusive for that. And in case I didn't say all of these, I guess you can call them questions, but these points right here, these are the learning objectives at the beginning of each lecture that whenever they write your exams, they pull a question that has to be tied back to one of these learning objectives. So if you understand everything in the learning objective, in theory, they shouldn't really be able to ask you anything that you don't know. All right. Describe the major cavities of the body. All right. So hopefully you had a chance to answer that. The first one we're going to talk about is the dorsal cavity. So one way I always remember this is that Sharks, whales, they have a dorsal fin. And where's the dorsal fin? It's on their back or towards the back. And so there's two areas inside of the dorsal cavity. So we have the cranial cavity. Obviously, that's going to house. It's going to house the brain. Then we have the spinal, or the you might also hear it the vertebral cavity, and that's going to be talking about your spinal cord. Next one we have is the ventral cavity. So your ventral cavity is kind of split up. You have your thoracic cavity. And your thoracic cavity, so you're going to be thinking your different pleural cavities. So like your different pleural cavities. So you're going to be thinking your lungs. But then you also have your mediastinum. And so that's going to be things like your heart, trachea, your esophagus fits in there. It's all things that are kind of in the ventral or more anterior part of your body. And then you have your your abdominopelvic cavity. And so that's going to have obviously your abdominal cavity and your pelvic cavity. So in the abdominal cavity, you're thinking just everything that you would think of with GI. So stomach, liver, intestines, spleen, things like that. And then in your pelvic cavity, you're thinking things like your bladder, reproductive organs. So let's put repro organs. And then rectum. So I would advise look up the picture if this doesn't make sense, but I think after you see the picture, it should make a little bit more sense for you. All right. So now we're getting a little bit more into the chemistry part. So define the terms matter, element, and atom, and do the following. So I'll give you just a second here. Okay. So let's define these terms real quick. So matter definition is going to be anything that has mass and takes up space. And so an element it's a substance that cannot be further broken down. So some big examples. Actually, we'll talk about some in just a second, but like fluorine, chlorine, sodium, things like that. Okay. Then an atom is the smallest unit of an element. retaining the chemical properties of that element. So list the 4 elements that comprise 96% of human body weight. Give me just a second here. Okay. So here, I'll put it right here. So the 4 elements, it's going to be carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, and oxygen. So those are the big 4 that make up 96% of our body weight. So borderline all of them, or all of it. Okay, so and then describe the components of an atom as well as describe the role of electrons in the formation of chemical bonds. So I'm gonna kind of answer both of these two together. So in an atom, we have protons, we have neutrons, and those are also in the nucleus. So you're only going to have protons and neutrons in the nucleus. And then what you have is these little, they're called shells along the outside. And these are going to have these guys called, what? I'll give you a second. These are called electrons. So electrons, they carry a -1 charge. Protons carry a +1 charge. Neutrons are going to be chemically neutral. And so describe the role of electrons in the formation of chemical bonds. So when you have an atom, so we're going to take this one here, erase some of it. So whenever we have 2 atoms that come together to form a chemical bond, there's a few different ways they can do this. But what happens is we have these shells, and the electrons that are on this outer ring right here, their outer shell, those are called valence electrons. And those are the ones that really determine the chemical properties of an atom. And so by exchanging the electrons, there's a few different ways we can do it. We're going to talk about it in this question, but that's how the bonds are formed. It's all in the electrons. Remember that proton number? Never changes. Never, 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 never changes. So electron number can change, and you guys know that. Like for example, actually, we'll get into it later, so I'm not going to worry about that right now. But yeah, proton number never changes. So let's differentiate between ionic, covalent, and hydrogen bonds. Give me just a second. All right. So for ionic bonds, this is where, real quick, just because I'm afraid I don't want to lose you. The shorthand for electron is that, because it has a negative charge. So electrons are stolen. So what do I mean by that? So we will, whoops, if I get my thing to work, there we go. So we're going to use this example here. So say for instance, and this is not going to, the amount of electrons and protons and neutrons, that's not correct. I'm just doing this because it's just for simplicity's sake. So say that we have sodium right here, and we have chlorine right here. So what happens is chlorine will come close. It will take one of these electrons right here, And so now it's stolen, but we form something called NaCl. And then something important about ionic bonds is that they're going to form crystalline structures. And so that's why you have things like table salt. It's like a powder. Okay. Next we have covalent. Covalent bonds, and this is where electrons are shared. And so my high school biology teacher said sharing is caring, caring is covalent. So the same thing that happened up here will happen again, but we're not going to form this crystalline structure, and the electron is going not, it's not going to be stolen. They're going to be sharing them. So two atoms will share that electron. Then we have hydrogen bonds. Okay, and so hydrogen bonds are where that's the symbol for hydrogen. So it's where you'll have an interaction where the hydrogen atom is going to bridge two electronegative atoms. So I know that's a lot. Um, Typically, it's going to be carbon, oxygen, nitrogen. That's the big ones. And so just a quick example. So say that we have water. More water. So water is H2O. So we got two H's and one O. And remember that oxygen is slightly more electronegative, which means that it likes electrons more. And so every once in a while, you're going to have a slightly more positive electron density at the oxygen because it's pulling it harder. And so that will give this slightly electronegative, but it'll make the hydrogen slightly electropositive, right? Because it's losing that electron. And so the same thing is happening in all of these. And so if we have an electropositive with an electronegative, we're going to have a little bit of a bond that forms right here. That is a hydrogen bond. And individually, they're pretty weak, but whenever you put them together, they're very strong. And that's what gives you something called surface tension. And so if somebody, say for some reason, they jump off a really, really high bridge or a high cliff, whenever they slam against the water really hard, that's why it feels like a ton of bricks, is because you're breaking these hydrogen bonds. And they're very, very tough whenever they're together. All right, so describe the formation of ions, including the difference among electrolytes, cations, and anions. So I'll give you a second. So the biggest thing that we need to remember is that, or is the definition of electrolytes, and this is going to be minerals in your blood or body fluid that carry an electrical charge. So cations, for example, and I always remember this, that they keep a positive charge because of the T, and it looks like a positive. So positive charge. And so when I think of positive, I think of sodium as an example, potassium as an example, calcium. And when I think of anions, I don't really have a like a mnemonic or anything for this one. I just know it's the opposite. So this is a negative charge. And so you can think of things like chloride or fluoride. Explain the difference between a molecule and a compound and list 5 reasons why water is essential to life. Okay, so a molecule is going to be when two or more atoms bond together. A big thing here is that the atoms can be the same or they can be different. So an example of same would be oxygen or O2. And then an example of different would be water, so H2O. Okay, then we have a compound. The compound is just a molecule that contains two or more different types of atoms. So real quick, all compounds are molecules, but not all molecules are compounds. This is not a compound. But this is a compound because it has two or more different types of atoms. All right. And so the next one lists 5 reasons why water is essential to life. So one is a universal solvent. So you can pretty much put anything in water and eventually it will end up being dissolved in it. Two is temperature regulation. So it has something called a high heat capacity, not necessarily important for our purposes, but it just means that it absorbs and releases heat slowly. So like we use water, sweat, in order to regulate our temperature. Three, water is going to be very handy in chemical reactions. You have to have it. So you have these two types of reactions. So one's called hydrolysis. And if you remember a lysis, we talked about lysis. That just means whenever you're splitting something or breaking molecules apart, but you're breaking it apart using water. You can also have dehydration reactions, and that's where you take water out. Typically, you're going to be building molecules this way. I'm not so much worried about this. This is not that important unless it mentioned it in your book. But just know that water is very important for chemical reactions. And then 4, so lubrication. So it reduces friction in things like your joints, your digestive tract, your eyes. And the last one is it is a good transport medium. So, for example, your blood plasma is predominantly water. All right. Next, explain the role of catalysts and enzymes. So, catalysts are going to be substances that speed up the rate of a reaction. And so enzymes are an example of a catalyst. So some enzymes are also like think some specific proteins, and that's their whole role is they function to their technical way is that they lower something called the activation energy of a reaction. So, for example, say we have a mountain right here, okay, and then say that the activation energy is what it would take for you to roll this ball up the hill. Basically, what enzymes do is they come in and they just kind of cut this mountain down a little bit. So now you still have to get the ball up the hill, but now say the hill is only like that big. So you're going to reach the top a lot faster. So that's what they mean by activation energy. So when your enzymes, catalysts, proteins, all of that, they're kind of all the same name for substances or things that speed up the rate of a reaction. And enzymes and proteins, they're highly, highly specific to location. So they need certain temperatures to work. They need a certain pH level to work. And so that's why some of your proteins, once they end up, like if you, like some of the proteins in your neurons would die immediately in your stomach because the pH is so low compared to the brain. Okay, so define pH and differentiate between acids and bases. So pH, there's probably a really, really fancy definition. The way I always remember it is how many hydrogen ions are present. All right, so we have acids and bases. So real quick, what is the pH range that's considered like compatible with life? It has to be this to be compatible. So the good range, Goldilocks range, is 7.35 to 7.45. That's where our body operates. Now, if we go this way, we're considered acidic. So even though the pH goes down, the hydrogen ion concentration goes up. Now, if we do the opposite, so we go 7.46 or above, we are talking about alkalotic or alkalosis. So that's when we'll have a high pH, but low hydrogen ion concentration. And so you're going to be thinking things like bleach. Yeah, and then acidic, you can think things like, I mean, even your own urine, but like lemon juice, stomach acid, things like that. And so, like I said, your body loves this range. And so, if you get a question 7.35 to 7.45, this is where your body wants to be. And any even small deviation outside of that will cause, can be pretty severe and fatal symptoms and conditions. But you'll learn all about that in pathophys when you get there. Okay. So, list the 6 forms of energy and describe the role of adenosine triphosphate, which is ATP, and energy transfer. All right, so the 6 forms of energy are going to be chemical, chemical, electrical, mechanical, thermal, radiant, and then last but not least, nuclear. Okay. So chemical energy, like to think that like this is the energy that's stored in chemical bonds. So whenever your stomach acid breaks apart food, that's an example of chemical energy. Electrical energy, so I like to think of nerve impulses, right? Because your nervous system is basically just a whole bunch of insulated wires. Mechanical energy, I like to think of like so you have muscle contraction. So an example of this is peristalsis. So then, if you guys remember, that's just like the rhythmic movements of your muscle contracting and relaxing, especially like your esophagus or your intestines to kind of push any kind of food and bolus through. So you have thermal energy, and this is the heat produced by like your metabolism. You have radiant energy, so I like to think of this as like UV rays, um, sunlight. And then lastly, we have nuclear energy. So this is going to be in things like the energy that's stored in the nucleus of an atom. Like we talked about up here, it would be the energy that's stored here. All right. Differentiate between a mixture, solution, suspension, colloidal suspension, and precipitate. So the big three. So in a solution, so we have a little solution right here. Did I put a picture? No. So I have a little picture right here. The solution is going to be whatever the liquid is mixed in completely with the solute. So this is like your stereotypical NaCl. I don't know what the exact percent is, but like say you have 5% NaCl, that's an example of a solution. A solution really can't be separated very easily, where a mixture could be. Then we have suspension. So if we take our same example here, draw a little test tube. Suspension or colloidal suspension, that's where you're still going to be able to see the solutes. And then a precipitate. So that would be if we have our fluid, whatever that is, but then we have a collection down here. That is the precipitate. Not expecting too many questions on this, but maybe expect one or two. So sure you know those definitions.